Hi, folks. I'm joined by my colleagues, Carl Takei and Paige Fernandez, and we are here to talk about policing. In the video series that we put out before this conversation, you saw examples of uprising and police response in 1919 in Chicago, in 1935 in Harlem, in 1967 in Detroit, in 1992 in Los Angeles. You saw the reports that came out about all of those incidents and how they were saying exactly the same thing. And then on January 6th, we saw a method of policing during the insurrection attempt at the United States Capitol that was horrifying. How did we get here, and how do we move to someplace different? So, Carl, I want to start with you. There's been a recent shift in the ACLU thinking about the subject of policing. Can you tell people what we've been kind of wrestling with?
Yeah. So this summer, the ACLU took a position in favor of divesting from police and reinvesting in communities. And for folks on the outside, that may have seemed like a quick shift, but it was actually years in the making. The folks who are in this discussion today, the three of us, were intimately involved in a process of going to grassroots organizations, collecting input and feedback from them about how the ACLU has approached police practices, and finding out what we were doing right, what we were doing wrong, and trying to develop an overall vision and strategy that would guide our police practices work. And one of the most consistent pieces of feedback that we got was that we really needed to shift away from just, the focus on trying to make police better at what they do, and focus instead on divesting functions, power, and responsibilities from police departments and into, life-giving, non-police dependent alternatives. And so, that really is the North Star for our policing work now.
Well, Carl, I appreciate that. And when you described the process that you and Paige and I and others were involved in about going around to different cities, it sounds kind of almost intellectual. But Paige, these meetings were pretty intense.
They were intense. And I, think that we kind of anticipated them being intense. I mean, when you're talking to community members, right? Policing is such a localized, community-based problem, and it looks different everywhere across the country. But a lot of the people we met with were community advocates, people who do this on their free time, right? Don't do this as a full-time job. And largely they do it because they have been impacted by policing, or they know family members or friends who have been impacted negatively by policing. And so these conversations were difficult, right? Talking to people who've been directly impacted by such a violent, harmful, oppressive institution is going to be intense. There are a lot of emotions. And I think we often forget, when we talk about it, sometimes at national organizations or, on panels, we talk about it kind of in an intellectual manner, right? But this is at its core a human problem, right? That deeply impacts people emotionally and mentally and physically. And so obviously there are going to be intense emotions. And I think it was really important that we allowed those emotions to be expressed, and that these meetings really allowed for people to be vulnerable and honest about their truths and what they're seeing, because that's what we want to be informed about, right? We want to make sure any position the ACLU takes is informed by people who've been most harmed by the institutions of policing.
Well, Carl, you said that this was kind of a shift, and it was. I mean, our lawsuits in the past largely were focused on police departments engaging in inappropriate, unnecessarily violent, unconstitutional behaviors, we would come in and sue that department. We would often ask for money to go to the department for additional training, for implicit bias instruction. And that theory seems to be moving slightly away. What's behind that?
So part of it is that first I want to be clear that not all of our lawsuits were, focused purely on police reform before.
Exactly.
For example, we had, a robust set of work trying to get police out of schools, for example, and we put out a number of reports about how like schools underinvest in functions like counselors, and instead over and over again fund police in schools instead of actually providing the services that students need. There's some of the work that we did was already focused on shifting away from dependence on police to solve social problems that have much better solutions. But the other reason why we really wanted to shift toward this focus is first, following the lead of Black-led grassroots organizations that for the past several years have increasingly aligned around this larger critique of the enormous role that police play in the lives of Black and brown people. And this is something that goes back hundreds of years, back to the origins of policing in this country. The first municipal police department in the United States was actually in Charleston, South Carolina, and it was a slave patrol. The purpose of the Charleston Police Department, when it was first conceived during slavery, was to monitor and surveil the Black enslaved population of Charleston and prevent them from planning any sort of resistance or efforts to achieve freedom. And that has been a through line in the way in which police departments have dealt with Black and brown communities, and especially Black communities in the United States. So you can't ignore that backdrop. The other part of this is that police really have two primary tools: guns and handcuffs, that they bring to any situation. And those are not the right tools for the vast majority of situations that police are called to deal with. If you look at FBI statistics, for example, the vast majority of arrests that police make in this country, more than 10 million arrests every year, don't actually relate to homicides or rapes or the kinds of much more serious offenses that you might expect. They are quality of life offenses. They are mental health crises. They are disputes between individuals that might be able to be mediated without the need for guns and handcuffs.
Well, you mentioned the slave patrols in Charleston, South Carolina, and that connection to early policing. And what I think is important is to understand that those things that were developing in the colonies, it's not like they all went away. Article 4 of the Constitution says that anyone, quote unquote, held to service. They didn't want to use the word slavery or slave. That didn't come till the 13th or 14th Amendment. But Article 4 talks about anyone that is held to service must be returned to their owner upon demand. The Constitution of the United States, our founding document, actually made Black attempts at freedom illegal and unconstitutional. And so, Paige, I'm thinking about that history and how we're trying to take these meetings that you and Carl did going around the country and mold that into a different approach for what we advocate about policing. What are some of the immediate or urgent asks that we're going to consider with the Biden administration? We know they're about to, they're going to announce very quickly some things that they're going to do, but what are we asking the Biden administration to consider when it comes to police?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think it's interesting because last week was when the Biden administration signed the executive orders around the criminal legal system and around policing, right? And so what we really want to see, I think it's interesting, right, that we need to talk about the federal government, but also recognize that the federal government in many ways is limited in reducing the role and responsibilities and funding of police, right? And I think we'll get to that later when we talk about the importance of doing local community-based work, because
Absolutely.
There's so much power in local governments. But for the Biden administration, I think there are a few key things. And one of the first is something that a lot of folks have been talking about over the past few months since the murder of George Floyd, which is abolishing qualified immunity. And I think this is key. And it's also, I think, really interesting because there is a kind of left and right alliance on that issue. I think we've worked with some of our partners who are a little bit further to the right on abolishing qualified immunity. And I don't know, Carl, if you want to chime in here to talk a little bit about
Right, let's tell people what qualified immunity is, because we use that term a lot and know what it is, but I think there are a lot of folks who don't. If they hear the concept, they might even be surprised that it's there. Carl, what is qualified immunity?
Yeah, so qualified immunity is basically, it allows police officers to engage in unconstitutional and illegal acts and escape liability based on a defense that a reasonable officer might have believed that what they were doing was legal. It is designed to protect, and I'm quoting from a Supreme Court decision, all but the plainly incompetent from liability. And the result of this is horrifying. One of the ACLU's cases actually went up to the Supreme Court and then ultimately was denied cert, which means the Supreme Court declined to hear the case. But in Baxter versus Bracey, a police officer was chasing after Mr. Baxter, and Mr. Baxter surrendered. He put his hands up, and the police officer sicked a dog on Mr. Baxter, and he was seriously injured by the dog bites. And the officer benefited from qualified immunity. Mr. Baxter's case was dismissed because the lower courts held that a reasonable officer in the circumstances might have believed that it was legal to sick a dog on somebody who had already surrendered.
And when you say his case was dismissed, Mr. Baxter filed a lawsuit against the police officer.
Yes, that's right.
And so, Paige, you're saying that we're getting some traction with groups and individuals that are perhaps a bit more conservative than some other groups. What is it about qualified immunity that you think is bringing that traction from groups that we might not consider to be partners all the
time? I think it is just how egregious the standard is, right? Like, it is so appalling and shocking. And as Carl's kind of going over exactly what it means, every time I hear it, I'm like, what? How is this possible? It makes it so hard to hold police accountable. And I think, something that a lot of people across the political spectrum can agree on is that police should be held accountable, right? And so this huge barrier to holding them accountable is so incredibly frustrating and angering. And I think that's kind of what brings people together on this issue, is that it's impossible in many ways to hold police accountable for their actions.
I think there's a narrative in America that has just gone that the police are such heroes and their jobs are so difficult that they can do anything they want. And our response as Americans should just be, thank you very much. And if you went too far, that's okay. And that's a narrative that is now being challenged from the left, from the right, and a narrative that I don't think is going to survive much longer because it's not supported by the facts. So Paige, qualified immunity is one thing. Are there other things that we're going to try and push for in terms of changing both either the face of policing or the focus of policing or the size of policing?
Yeah, I think there are two other things I want to talk about. And the first is setting a federal lethal force standard that goes beyond the existing standards. Right now, we really have this kind of reasonable standard. I'm going to toss it to Carl after this to explain a little bit of the legalities around that. But we're really trying to push for a very strong lethal force standard. So officers can only use lethal force when absolutely necessary to prevent imminent harm, serious physical injury, or death to an identifiable person, only after they've exhausted all de-escalation tactics and techniques, so that it is truly used as a absolute last resort, which right now we know it's not, right? It is almost used as a first resort for officers in many cases. That is the first thing they rely on, is lethal use of force. And so we're really trying to push the Biden administration to raise the standard on the federal level when lethal force can be used. And Carl, I was hoping you could kind of explain, the difference between the necessary or the reasonable standard and the necessary standard that we're pushing for.
Yeah.
And Carl, as you go into that, let me just say, before I came to the ACLU, I practiced in the state of Washington, which has one of the strongest self-defense standards in the country, including a clear statement that if a person is mistaken, reasonably mistaken about the use of self-defense and they kill somebody, they're not guilty of a crime if that mistake is reasonable. That was the law for just individuals. Up until a couple of years ago, a police officer could kill you in Washington and escape responsibility if it was reckless, unreasonable, and unnecessary, because of this concept that the police just have such a difficult job that you have to let them do virtually anything with no checks. Can you just talk about how that standard is in effect and what changes to it would be?
Yeah. So I think the starting point is a lot of people would think that the standard is, necessary, that police officers only kill people when necessary. But that's not. The Supreme Court has set a nationwide sort of minimum standard of objectively reasonable force. And that means that when police officers create the danger that they then use to justify killing somebody, that can be considered objectively reasonable. When police officers evaluate all of the options, they see that it is possible to de-escalate, to reposition themselves behind cover, to use these other options that are available to them, but then they make a conscious decision to, pull the trigger instead of using those non-lethal or less lethal options, that can still be considered objectively reasonable. And so, that standard that allows police officers to make these decisions to kill people when they have easily available alternatives to, that are like right in front of them, is the reason why it is often really hard to sue police officers for, killing people unnecessarily. And also, it's one of the reasons, although not the only reason, why a lot of prosecutors are so reluctant to charge officers who kill people.
I just on that point, Carl, I often reflect back to revolt of enslaved people. You talked about South Carolina in the 1600s, a revolt in Stono, South Carolina, where white people were killed by enslaved people. And that very next year that was 1639, in 1640, they passed a law basically saying that the enslaved people were going to be kept in due subjugation and obedience. And the state next to them or close to them, Virginia, passed a law saying if an enslaved person is killed while resisting a master, no felony is involved. And that law isn't on the books in any country any state in America right now. The law about if you resist a master and you're killed, the master hasn't committed a felony. But if you take the number of unarmed Black people that have been killed by police in the last 10 years, I think NPR last week came out with a report on that. If you take that number of people and compare it to the number of police officers who have been charged for killing any of those unarmed Black people, and then you compare that number to the number of police officers that have been convicted of anything for killing those unarmed Black people, that law may not be on the books anywhere, but it's still in effect when it comes to policing in Black communities.
Absolutely. Just on that note, I kind of want to point out these really striking numbers from Campaign Zero, who've tracked police killings since 2013. And according to their analysis, 98% of police who killed people have not been charged. And 99% of police who killed people have not been convicted. That is a shocking number. And I think it's so deeply disturbing. So just wanted to throw that out there for folks to really understand the magnitude of how much police are protected and how often they can act with impunity.
And before we leave this topic, I think I just want to add one thing. America had to watch, referring to the book written by William Burroughs called Naked Lunch. A naked lunch moment is that moment when everyone has to look at what is really on the end of their fork. And America had one of those moments when George Floyd was choked to death. The most stunning and revealing thing about that murder to me was the casualness of it. That officer knelt on George Floyd's neck, and if you look at that video, neither of his hands were anywhere near his gun. He was not concerned about anyone stopping him from doing what he was doing. And he knelt there casually until George Floyd was dead. And he clearly didn't expect anything to be done about it. That's one of the things that I think is just so amazing to me. When I say amazing, I shouldn't say amazing because it ain't like it's new, but it's at a level that is just continually shocking. Paige or Carl, I throw to either of you. We've talked about some short-term things. What about longer-term visions for policing? And I know, Carl, you have often talked about a group called Freedom House in Pittsburgh. And tell us how Freedom House is maybe a glimpse into a longer-term vision of what policing can become in America.
Yeah. So, one of the situations where, like people who are critics of divest, reinvest, or defund the police often bring up is like, well, there aren't models that have been used at scale that, provide alternatives to police. What are you going to do in these situations? And the fact of the matter is, we have built alternatives to police in the past. In the 1960s, there was no such thing as an emergency medical technician. And if you wanted an ambulance to get to the hospital, you had two choices. One was to call the police, and they would put you in the back of a police van or a squad car. And the other option was to call a funeral home, and they would send a hearse with a siren on top of it. They used hearses because those were some of the only vehicles that could lay somebody down flat in the back.
Right.
And either way, you got no medical care on the way to the hospital. In Black neighborhoods in Pittsburgh, the funeral homes refused to service those communities. And so if you were Black in Pittsburgh, your only choice was to call the cops. That is where Freedom House came in. It was a Black-led organization that really thought about, we can do this better. And they created an ambulance service that was staffed by, at first, doctors, and then they created this category of EMTs to staff the ambulances. And they provided ambulance services that were not dependent on the police, not dependent on the funeral homes, and that provided top-notch medical care on the way to the hospital. And that, was created in the mid-late 1960s. And by the early 1970s, Freedom House had been adopted as a model around the country. There were national standards for EMTs. And that is why anytime you call 911 and you have a physical medical emergency, you get an ambulance staffed with EMTs.
So when my next door neighbor several years ago had a heart attack at 2:00 in the morning, I ran outside because I heard noise, and it was the ambulance and the EMTs that were there, not the police throwing her into the back of a squad car saying, let's see if we can get you to the hospital on time. That would have been considered impossible because no one had ever seen it before. And so the fact that people hadn't seen it before was restricting our ability to say, this is an alternative to the way we're doing things.
Yeah, so what we need to do today is to begin piloting and funding all of these alternatives to police, all of these ways in which we can respond to real social problems without relying on police, and then use broader state and federal funding to bring all of those alternatives to scale.
And we were talking here about kind of a longer term vision, and Paige, maybe you can just reflecting on the video series that we did, in terms of convincing both government actors and other people that piecemeal reform isn't enough. I get sick to my stomach when I look at that video series and think, my God, a commission was saying things in 1919 that are still true today. How is it that we haven't learned these lessons?
Yeah, I mean, in thinking about kind of the ACLU's long-term advocacy vision, I think we're really thinking about how do we change, government actors' views, but also more importantly, how do we educate the general public, right, about this and about the possibilities, right? And I was like smiling the whole time Carl was telling the story because I just love the story of Freedom House so much because I think it shows us that there are possibilities. And I think, there's this quote from Angela Davis where she says, policing in this country is a given like life and death. And why? Why do we think like that, right? Why is policing such a given in this country? And why does it have to exist? And so I think in the long term, we're thinking about how do we educate people about the possibilities? How do we teach more people about what happened with Freedom House and how that spread across the nation? How do we really expand beyond what we think right now and get creative about alternative resources and services? So I think really thinking long-term, there's a lot of education that has to go into it. But I also want to kind of mention just the influence of police, of law enforcement and police unions on politicians, right? And I think that's something people really need to talk about more when we're talking about shifting politicians, elected officials' views. We also have to talk about how they're influenced by law enforcement and how many of them think if they go against law enforcement, they won't be able to get reelected, right? Because the police generally are incredibly popular in communities. And
that's changing a little bit, isn't it?
It is changing a little bit, and I'm glad, right? There has definitely been a shift after
let me be clear. I'm not saying I'm anti-police, because I'm not. I respect them and I respect the job that they do, but their role in American society is completely out of whack. And we have got to change that. So this is not about being anti-police at all. I'm sorry, Paige, I just had to throw that in.
No, I'm glad that you interrupted with that. But it is, there has to be education and there has to be this conversation around how elected officials are influenced, whether it's by police union donations to their campaigns or the close ties they have to law enforcement. But I really think it starts in the community and getting people to understand what an outsized role police play in this country. And I'm thinking about, when we look internationally, I lived abroad for a few years in England, and I never once saw a police officer with a gun. Not once in 2 years of living in England did I ever see a police officer with a gun.
And let's be clear, that doesn't mean they don't have armed police.
Yep.
Because they do, but they're not making a show of it like we do in America. And so it's important just to realize there are other models out there. It's not like this is the only way it could possibly be.
Exactly. And they even have completely separate numbers for police and for emergency services, right? And that includes medical emergencies, as well as behavioral health crises and mental health crises as well. An entirely different number that's easy to access, right? It's just 111. And then they have
it's interesting, just watching watching a movie made in England, and police are going into like these bank robbers' home. And when they kick the door, they say, armed police, armed police. They are announcing themselves differently because what they're essentially saying is, hey, y'all in there, we don't always carry guns. That's like stupid. But this time, because you have guns, we're actually carrying them too. Yeah. And so that's a completely different approach to the way policing is done. And these are in Western nations. So it's not like a fairy tale.
Exactly.
Well, we have gotten all kinds of questions, several questions at least, in different areas from different folks. And maybe let's try and answer some of those. Paige, I know that there was a person who sent you a question. What works? Which communities have seen a decrease in police violence, and how did they achieve this? So I guess he's asking kind of, are there examples out there of things that you're talking about actually coming to fruition and working?
This is a really sad answer, but in looking at communities who have seen a decrease in police violence, there really are none. And that's not to say, police violence varies every year in different jurisdictions. The numbers go up and down. But I think the fact that I cannot think of one place where we've seen a significant decrease in police violence is really striking. I'd love for Carl to chime in if he has an example here, but I think the fact that I cannot think of one singular place that has had a significant decrease in police violence points to and speaks to just how ineffective and fruitless minor reforms that just tinker around the edges are, right? There have been, in a lot of these jurisdictions, there have been reforms implemented, whether it's implicit bias training, whether it is kind of just some minor changes in how police interact and giving them a little bit more resources. But I don't think to date there is any jurisdiction in this country that has been willing to take the bold steps that will lead to the transformational change that we know will actually reduce police violence. But I'd love to hear Carl's answer on that.
I was going to say, you said maybe Carl knows something.
Yeah,
Carl,
I'm like,
can
maybe
you help us
I'm
out?
forgetting something, or maybe I'm just a complete cynic.
I mean, I think that, the picture is not quite as dismal as what you say, but it points in the same direction, because there have been like various DOJ consent decrees around the country targeting police violence, the use of lethal force, oftentimes the use of tasers. And the pattern in those cases is often that the recorded violence goes up as they begin actually keeping better records of who they're tasing, who they're beating. And then over the life of the consent decree, it starts trending downward again. But then there's a whole question about what happens after the consent decree ends. And there is this huge problem of regression to the mean. It's an incredible challenge for police chiefs to maintain the benefits of the consent decree over time. and all of this connects to what we were talking about earlier, that if police are tasked with fewer responsibilities, if police have contact with fewer people, then by necessity, they will be engaging in violence against fewer people.
So that if you can't stop somebody because you smell marijuana on their breath, or you can't stop somebody because you think they have marijuana in their pocket because marijuana is legal, then the police officer doesn't talk to that person, doesn't confront that person. There's not any kind of a mistake or somebody saying, hey, don't touch me. And then the police officer says, you're resisting arrest. And now the ball's up in the air and we don't know how that situation is going to end. And I think, just apropos, Carl, of what you've been saying, I'd like for people to understand that the Minneapolis, Minnesota Police Department, which has a budget, I believe, in 2017 of more than $300 million for their police department. Let that number sink in for a minute. These are the trainings that they had before George Floyd was killed. Procedural justice training, implicit bias training, mindfulness training, de-escalation training. They had a ban on warrior-style policing. They had a program that was focused on early identification of officers who were having problems with their behavior. They had training on mental health crisis intervention, and they had trainings and events to try and achieve reconciliation in communities of color. All of that money and all of those resources went into changing the way police encounter people under current circumstances. And George Floyd is just as dead. And so that, to me, is an indication that we have to look at other alternatives. And just to end this kind of track, maybe, I want people to really think about the fact that police don't prevent crime. They never have. They respond to crime. They don't prevent crime. So if you want to really address crime, then the causes of crime have to be where we're focusing. Paige, you got another question from an Instagram user, and what she was interested in is, are there some alternative models to policing and action either here in the US or elsewhere?
Yeah, so I already kind of touched on England, and kind of the model in England is replicated in a lot of Western European countries as well. But I do want to lift up another example, which Carl's probably exhausted about us talking about this at this point, but it's Cahoots, which is a program that was piloted in Eugene, Oregon, which dispatches two-person teams of medics and crisis workers, rather than law enforcement, to emergency calls involving severe behavioral health crises. So they provide immediate stabilization support to individuals experiencing medical or psychological crises. And it also offers kind of broad wraparound services, including crisis counseling and suicide prevention and intervention, conflict resolution and mediation, substance use treatment, and housing support, right? Like this really robust, amazing project. And we actually know that in 2019, that team handled nearly 1 in 5 of the city's 133,000 911 calls that year. And they only requested police backup about 100 times.
So let's stop there for a minute, because even in this alternative method, if these experts who are not police officers get to the scene and determine that they can't handle it without the assistance of police, they can still call for that assistance, right?
Exactly, right? And it also, I think this is really important to note, because I think people get really weary around the idea of divestment, reinvestment, defunding, that this program helped save Eugene, like the metropolitan area, around $14 million in ambulance and emergency hospitalization costs alone, right? So it's like providing, it's better fiscally for jurisdictions, and also really provides the support that people need.
It seems like it's a matter of having your mind have the capability of breaking out of a paradigm that there's only one way to do this. And when you look for alternative ways, if what you're really looking for is, can we provide greater services for less money? Here is an alternative that has worked and that people could look at, and that is scalable.
Yep.
Well, and not just for less money, it's a question of like, who is the appropriate person to send? And we have spent so much time and resources on trying to sort of bolt on these additional responsibilities onto police officers, when really, like, we should be starting with a blank slate and considering what is the expertise, you know, what is the training, what are the relationships that are needed for people to respond to these different types of situations.
And Carl, I just think that's so important. Going back to square one, it doesn't mean, this isn't like something radical. And let's be clear, we're not talking about getting rid of police departments tomorrow. What I'm saying is it possible for Minneapolis to keep people as safe as they are today for less than $340 million a year? And the answer is, you bet it is. And it just takes our will to look at this, as you say, Carl, with a blank slate, and then move forward from there with the understanding that some policing presence in America is going to be necessary, but it doesn't have to look like it does right now. And both of you have mentioned police unions. Carl, you got a question. What's the best strategy to limit the influence of police unions giving money to politicians? Who are our allies in seeking to curb the power of police unions? And I might just throw in, when they say giving money to politicians, police unions giving money to prosecutors that are going to decide whether their members have committed a crime when they kill somebody.
Yeah. I mean, I think I take a little issue with the framing of the question around just money, because you know, everybody, you know, like, there are all kinds of actors in the political system who give money, and you know, for the ACLU, the big issue is transparency around that, like, you know, those campaign contributions, and in fact, for police unions, it is less about the number of dollars and more about the influence and the role that they play.
Right.
Police unions have an unearned legitimacy in society. They are allowed to speak for you know, public safety as a whole when they do not represent public safety or community safety. They are allowed to speak even for, you know, the part of community safety that's handled by law enforcement, even though they are often at loggerheads with police chiefs and at loggerheads with rank and file members of police departments who are not white. And you know, in St. Louis, for example, there's an entirely separate Black police officers union because the majority police union is so racist. So I think when we talk about the power of police unions, a big part of diminishing that power is by naming what they actually represent and exposing them for what they are.
For example, the head of the police union in Seattle made some statements about the insurrection attempt on January 6th, about, you know, who was involved, and he is taking significant heat on that. And I think holding the union leaders accountable for their statements and their behavior, and putting that out in public so the city and the voters know, oh, that's what the police union stands for, and that's what they're saying. The police union is saying, don't get rid of qualified immunity. I want to put my dog on anybody I want to put my dog on. And as long as I can come up with some kind of concept that it could have been reasonable, nothing's going to happen to me. And that's what I want if I'm going to be a police officer. And maybe what that means is we need different police officers, because the bottom line is they work for us. It's not the other way around. It's not like they give me or grant me the right to walk around in my city without getting shot as long as I behave in a way that they think is appropriate. They work for us. And one of the questions that I got is, how does qualified immunity impact police, holding police accountable? And are there legal remedies being sought to address qualified immunity? And so, Carl, is qualified immunity this like magical thing that just exists in and of itself that you can't do anything about? I mean, is it written into a law, or did the Supreme Court just dream it up?
It really is something that was just dreamed up by the Supreme Court. You know, when after the Civil War, the Civil Rights Act, which you know, it's called Section 1983, was enacted. It, like, the entire idea of it was to protect people, especially formerly enslaved Black people, from abuses by state and local government officials. And it was a strict liability standard. It wasn't until the midway through the 20th century that the Supreme Court began chipping away at that, created the doctrine of qualified immunity.
Wait a minute. We can't be punishing police officers for like abusing Black people, because that's going too far.
Right. And so, you know, the expansion of qualified immunity really tracks the growth of the civil rights movement. And you know, we're now at this place where the doctrine was created and has been expanded and expanded and expanded over time. The ACLU, along with the Cato Institute, and you know, a whole very ideologically diverse range of partners, have been trying to raise the issue before the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, last year, what happened was, you know, a whole series of cases raising the issue of abolishing qualified immunity was denied cert by the Supreme Court. They refused to hear the cases. And the message that a lot of Supreme Court watchers have gotten from that is that the court is waiting for action from Congress.
And yeah, sorry, could I just add on that note that while the ACLU remains neutral on the Justice and Policing Act, the George Floyd Act on the federal level, because it does put more funding into police, which we do not agree with, there are good provisions in there, including abolishing and banning qualified immunity, right? And then I think there's one other bill on the federal level that deals with qualified immunity. And then on the state level, we saw in Colorado this year this ban on qualified immunity. And in New Mexico right now, during their current legislative section, they're working on banning qualified immunity as well. So I just think, you know, there are some legislative pushes going on.
And Paige, I wanted to relate to that because another question that came in kind of hit one of the issues that you just touched on. And I think it's also implicated by the fact that when you and Carl were on this tour of the United States, you were not talking about federal policing. And so the question of, do you impact this at the federal level, or do you impact this at the state level, or is it both? Could you just talk about that for a minute? Because it seems like those are two critical, they are different systems, but they have critical impact.
Yeah, so I think, you know, I get really excited talking about state governments because I think people overlook it, right? We have such an emphasis on the federal government and what can be done on the federal level, but really so much impactful work happens on the state and local level. And really the amount of power that state legislatures have is overlooked by, I think, many people. And it might be boring to folks, like talking about the ins and outs of state legislation, but there is so much to happen. I firmly believe that the most important work on policing will happen on the local and state level. Those are where we kind of are seeing the most bold steps being taken, and people actually listening to their community members. And that might come in part because they're representing fewer people than federal Congress people are. But there really is so much immense power in the state legislature and on the local level. And so, yes, does the federal government have a role to play in this work? 100%. They have a ton of responsibility, including the fact that they give out grants to police departments all the time, right? Like that needs to stop. But on the state level, there are also horrible state laws that need to be dealt with to really end kind of the mass criminalization of Black and brown people, of low income people, and to reduce the roles, responsibilities, and power of police. And in the meantime, hold police accountable. And I kind of just want to touch on that because we've been talking about accountability, but also divestment. And I think when we talk about accountability, raising the lethal force standard, I really want to highlight that this is a lot about harm reduction, right? We know we can't snap our fingers and have the US look the way we want it to look, with police playing a different role and, more resources dedicated to different services. But there do need to be steps taken that don't allow police to act with impunity, that allow for them to be held accountable, and that limit when they can cause significant harm to communities.
I want to end with one last question, and I want to throw it to both of you, because I don't think we can end this without talking about what we saw happen in Washington, D.C. on January 6th. And many people have said, well, if that had been Black protesters, you would have seen dead bodies all over the Capitol lawn because the police would have been shooting and they would have been using extreme violence to repel those protesters. There are many thoughts that I have about what I saw on January 6th, but Carl, let me come to you first. Are there lessons? Are there examples of the reality that we're facing that we can learn from what we all saw on that day?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first point that I think we have to emphasize when talking about the January 6th insurrection and the police response is that this was white supremacy at work in multiple ways, not only in the demands of the crowd that stormed the Capitol, but in the way that the high level police brass in the Capitol Police discounted the risk that this crowd of white people would engage in a violent insurrection and did not prepare for that risk. And
despite all the white supremacist violence that's been going on in the United States in the last several years.
Mm-hmm. And the thing is, it's not actually a break from what we saw this past summer. It is consistent with what we saw this past summer, because this past summer, we saw tremendous, hyper-aggressive, militarized police violence against protesters who came out in support of Black lives, while at the same time, leniency and in many cases, assistance to white supremacist militias who were coming out to protest as counter-protesters against the Black Lives Matter protesters. And, Kenosha is the most well-known example of this, where the police were literally handing out water bottles to the militias and saying, good job, while not enforcing the curfew against them, at the same time that they were mobilizing armored units against Black protesters.
Paige, any reflection that you had on January 6th? I know it was I don't have the adjective for it, but share with us what you were thinking.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I'm still reeling from it. I'm like post-attempted coup insurrection. I'm still reeling. But I think the biggest lesson that I think we can take out of this is that we cannot afford to not name white supremacy as a huge force in this country. People get uncomfortable about talking about white supremacy, particularly white folks, but we have to name it because we truly will not get anywhere in changing and transforming the institutions that further white supremacy until we acknowledge how deeply embedded white supremacy is in these institutions, particularly policing and our criminal legal system at large.
The thing I will just add to what both of you said is that the FBI has been saying for almost the last decade, there is a growing number of people with white supremacist views in entering law enforcement. If you go back to the reports, 1919 Chicago, 1935 Harlem, 1967 Detroit, 1992 Los Angeles, they are saying in those reports, there are elements of the police that do seem to have these white supremacist views. So this is nothing new. And I think our failure to deal, or let me put it this way, what we saw on January 6th is the result of the system that we have allowed to flourish in the United States. And so was I upset? Of course. Was I horrified? Yes. Was I surprised? Not one single bit. Let me say this, Carl and Paige, I just want to thank you. There's all kinds of work that we are doing at the ACLU, and the three of us have worked very closely together on the issues relating to policing in America. Our work is nowhere near done, but I think this has been important work on the issue of policing and important work for the ACLU, because we are an organization like every other living, breathing organization that is continuing to learn, continuing to evolve in our thinking as we go forward. And the efforts that were made before we go into a major policing platform, wouldn't it be a good idea to listen to the experiences of the people who are living with police impact in their lives every day? It was challenging, it was difficult, and it was one of the best things that the ACLU has ever done to help us inform our positions on critical issues. You will see more of this kind of behavior on this and other issues as the ACLU goes forward. But one of the things that the three of us can promise you from the American Civil Liberties Union is that we will be on the front line looking at police behavior, trying to hold police accountable, and trying to push America toward a vision that allows us to say we can actually spend less than $300 million a year in a mid-sized city in America and provide policing that is constitutional, respectful, and safe. Carl and Paige, thanks for hanging out with me today. And I just want to say thank you to our listeners and keep watching, because this issue is not going away.